The polished marble floor was a liar. It gleamed under the recessed lighting, promising effortless grace, but after 7 hours, my feet knew its true nature, a beautiful, unyielding tyrant. I shifted my weight, the subtle movement hidden by the long black apron tied around my waist. The murmur of low conversations, the delicate clink of silver on porcelain, the hushed whisper of wine being poured. It was the familiar symphony of a Saturday night service at Verve. My world was a 10-table section of starched white linen and carefully curated ambition.
I was good at my job.
I anticipated needs, refilled water glasses before they were empty, and navigated the narrow spaces between tables with a quiet efficiency that made my body, full and soft and unapologetically present, seem to glide. Then he arrived. He did not walk into the restaurant so much as the restaurant rearranged itself to accommodate his presence. The air thickened, the ambient noise dipping for a half-second before resuming, altered. I saw the suit first. Not just a suit, but a statement. A dark charcoal Tom Ford, tailored so precisely it seemed less like fabric and more like a second skin, molded to the lean, hard lines of his body. He moved with a predatory stillness, his shoulders broad, his posture absolute. With him was an older man, his face a roadmap of harsh judgments and disappointment, his own suit expensive, but worn with the stiffness of someone who preferred the old ways. My manager, a man who normally vibrated with nervous energy, became unnervingly smooth, his gestures fluid as he led them to the best table in the house, table 12, nestled in a discreet alcove with a view of the city lights. My table. My heart didn't race. It settled into a slow, heavy beat, a drum signaling a change in the weather. I took a steadying breath, picked up 2 leather-bound menus, and walked toward them. "Good evening," I said, my voice even and low, placing the menus on the table. "My name is Chloe. Can I start you with something to drink this evening?" The older man grunted, not looking at me. He was staring out the window, his expression sour. But the younger one, his eyes lifted to meet mine. They were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the light in the room, and held a chilling lack of emotion. He wasn't looking at a waitress, he was performing a threat assessment. His gaze was a physical weight, cataloging, dismissing. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Water. Still." His voice was a low baritone, smooth and cold as river stones. I poured the water from the chilled bottle on my tray, my movements deliberate, practiced. Not a single drop spilled. My hands were steady. They had to be. The older man began speaking in a low, rapid torrent of Korean. I didn't mean to listen. It was background noise, like the jazz trio in the lounge. But years of spending every afternoon after school at Mrs. Park's kitchen table had left their mark. My grandmother's best friend had filled my head with her stories and her language, a language that tasted of garlic and sesame oil and the sea-swept coast of her youth. The father's tone was sharp, accusatory. He gestured dismissively at the opulence of the restaurant. "This is what you build. Glass and steel? You forget the foundation. You forget the blood that waters the roots." The son, Kwon Jin-woo, I knew his name because my manager had whispered it like a prayer and a curse, said nothing.
His stillness was his reply.
His long fingers rested on the table, perfectly still, yet they radiated a tightly coiled violence. He let his father's words hang in the air and die. That's when it happened. The father looked directly at me for the first time, his eyes filled with a casual disdain. He wanted to dismiss me, to make a point to his son about the company he kept, the world he inhabited. He spoke to me, but his words were for his son. In that same rapid Korean, he said something crude, something about foreign women and their easy compliance. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a conscious thought. It was a reflex, buried deep, a muscle memory of respect for elders taught by a woman half a world away. I looked at the old man, bowed my head just slightly, and spoke. The words that came out were not the polished, sophisticated dialect of soul he had been speaking. They were Mrs. Park's words. A rough, country dialect from a southern province, the language of fishermen and farmers, thick with consonants and colored with the salt of the sea. An elder's words should be weighed like gold, for they carry the wisdom of a lifetime. Absolute silence. It was not a quiet moment. It was the sound of a vacuum being created, sucking all the air and noise out of our corner of the universe. The clatter of the kitchen faded. The music vanished. The older man's face, already stern, became a mask of disbelief, his jaw slack. The blood drained from his features, leaving behind a sallow, papery gray. But it was the sun I watched. Kwon Jinwoo did not move. Not a single muscle. But his eyes, they were no longer empty. They were black fire. He stared at me, and in his gaze, I saw the clicking of a well-oiled machine, gears turning, possibilities being calculated and discarded. I was no longer a piece of the scenery. I was an anomaly, an impossibility. And in his world, impossibilities were threats until proven otherwise. He slowly raised one hand, a quiet gesture to his two bodyguards who stood like statues near the entrance. They moved, not toward me, but to discreetly block the exits to the alcove. My manager started to approach, a nervous smile plastered on his face, and Jinwoo flicked his gaze to him for a single second. The man froze, then retreated as if he'd touched a live wire. Jinwoo's eyes came back to me. They held me in place more effectively than any wall. The silence stretched, thin and sharp as a razor's edge. He finally spoke, and his English was terrifyingly soft. "You will stay," he said. It was not a request. "Everyone else will leave." That was the moment the floor dropped out from under my world. The fine dining restaurant, the starched linen, the life I knew, it all dissolved into the background. There was only this man, his impossible stillness, and the terrible, focused weight of his attention. I had spoken 5 words in a language I had no right to know, and now I was his problem to solve. The private dining room was cleared with chilling efficiency. My manager scurried away, avoiding my eyes. The bodyguards remained, silent sentinels at the door. The father, after a furious, whispered exchange with his son, was escorted out, his final glare at me a promise of retribution. Then the door clicked shut, and it was just the two of us. Just me and Kwon Jinwoo, the most dangerous man in Seoul. He sat back in his chair, the picture of calm, but the tension radiating from him was a physical force. It pressed on my chest, making each breath a deliberate effort. He gestured to the chair opposite him.
"Seat."
My legs felt like they were moving through water, but I obeyed. I sank into the plush velvet, my waitress apron suddenly feeling like a ridiculous costume. He watched me, his dark eyes missing nothing. The way my hands trembled slightly before I clasped them in my lap. The way my gaze kept flicking toward the door. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, conversational, which was somehow more menacing than a shout. "My grandmother's friend," I said, my own voice tight. She was like a second grandmother to me. She was from a village on the southern coast, I didn't name it. Instinct told me to hold something back. "And what was her name?"
"Park."
"Mrs. Park." He considered this, his head tilted slightly. He was a predator studying unfamiliar prey. "Mrs. Park." From the south, he picked up a silver knife from the table, not to use it, but to hold it. He balanced it on one finger, the point aimed directly at my heart. The movement was mesmerizing, lethal. That dialect is very specific. It is not taught in schools. It is the language of a certain kind of people. People who value old loyalties. People who remember old debts. The knife stilled. And old betrayals. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a conversation. It was an interrogation. I had stumbled into a world with rules I didn't understand, and broken one of them without even knowing it existed. I just served her tea and listened to her stories. I said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. "That's all." "Is it?" he murmured. He set the knife down, the soft clink echoing in the silence. He rose from his chair and began to pace, his movements fluid and contained. He was a panther in a cage of his own making. My organization has enemies. Families who believe what is mine should be theirs. One of them, the Kims, they come from that same stretch of coast. They speak with that same accent. The accent of traitors. He stopped in front of me, looking down. I had to crane my neck to meet his gaze. So you can understand my confusion. A woman who looks like you, working in a place like this, speaking the language of my enemy. It is a curiosity I cannot afford to ignore. Before I could process what that meant, the world outside the window exploded. A flash of brilliant white light, followed a split second later by the deep, guttural boom of an explosion that shook the entire building. The reinforced glass of the window spiderwebbed but held. Car alarms began to shriek from the street below. Jin-woo didn't flinch. He moved. In one fluid motion, he was across the space between us, his hand clamping around my upper arm. He yanked me from the chair and threw me to the floor behind the heavy oak table, his own body covering mine like a shield. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and his cologne, an intoxicating mix of cedar and smoke. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a low growl in my ear, his breath warm against my skin. The weight of him was immense, solid, and terrifyingly real. My cheek was pressed against the cool marble, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my mind was surprisingly clear. This was real. This was happening. One of his men burst into the room, gun drawn.
Boss. Car bomb.
"It was meant for your father's vehicle. Casualties?" Jin-woo asked, his voice calm, never lifting from my side. "Two of ours in the security detail. The old man is secure. The Kims are getting bold." Jin-woo pushed himself off me, moving into a crouch. He looked at the chaos outside, then his eyes, hard and calculating, found mine again. I was still on the floor, a waitress in a ruined dining room, covered in dust. He saw me, truly saw me, and in that moment, a decision was made. "She comes with us," he said to his man. "She doesn't leave my sight." He reached down and pulled me to my feet. His grip was firm, impersonal, but it was the only solid thing in a world that had just been blown apart. He didn't give me a choice. I was no longer an anomaly. I was a piece on his chessboard, and the game had just turned deadly. In the chaos of the evacuation, surrounded by men with guns and broken glass underfoot, I could have tried to run. I could have screamed for the police. But as he pulled me through the wreckage of the kitchen, I saw one of the chefs, a young man named Marco, lying on the ground, a shard of glass embedded in his leg, blood pooling around him. Everyone was running, panicking. Without thinking, I ripped a clean tablecloth from a nearby cart, twisting it into a tightrope. "Wait," I said, pulling against Jin-woo's grip. He stopped, looking back at me with irritation that melted into something else as he saw what I was doing. I knelt by Marco, tying the cloth tightly above the wound. "Put pressure on it," I told one of the other cooks. "Keep it elevated." I looked up and met Jin-woo's eyes. He watched me, his expression unreadable. I had just taken a deliberate action, chosen to help in the middle of his war. I had not run. That was the moment something shifted between us. He saw not just a problem, but a person who didn't fall apart under pressure. His hand found my arm again, but this time, the grip was different. Less like a man holding a prisoner, and more like a man holding on to the only thing that made sense in the chaos. The penthouse was a silent fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Han River. The city lights spread out below like a carpet of scattered jewels, a world away from the sirens and smoke we'd left behind. Jin-woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid untouched. I was sitting on a white leather sofa that probably cost more than my college tuition, feeling utterly out of place. A medic had checked me over and pronounced me fine, just shaken. Shaken didn't begin to cover it. Jin-woo finally spoke, his voice quiet. "You handled yourself well back there." "He was bleeding," I said simply. "Most people would have run." "I'm not most people," the words were out before I could stop them. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared.
"No."
"You are not," he turned from the window, his eyes finally landing on me again. "The Kims tried to kill my father tonight. They used a bomb, because they are cowards. But they were also sending me a message." He took a step closer. "They believe I have a new weakness. They believe that weakness is you. Me? My voice was a whisper. They don't even know who I am. I'm just a waitress. You were in a private room with my father and me. You spoke a dialect that marks you as one of them or one of ours. You were with me when their attack happened. In their eyes, you are no longer just a waitress, you are mine. The word hung in the air between us.
Meaning.
It was possessive, absolute, and terrifying. It was also, in a strange way, a shield. They think you're my mistress, I stated, the realization dawning. Among other things, he said, his gaze intense.
A spy.
A hostage. A lover. They will project whatever narrative suits them. The truth is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is their perception. That's when I saw it. For a fraction of a second, as he spoke of family and betrayal, his composure cracked. A flicker of profound, old pain in his eyes. It was there, and then it was gone, his mask of cold control slamming back into place. But I had seen it. A wound. Who was she? I asked, the question soft but direct. He went very still.
Who?
The person my dialect reminded your father of. The reason he looked at me like I was a ghost. He was silent for a long time. He walked to the bar and refilled his glass, his back to me. I had a sister, he said, his voice low, rough with an emotion he refused to show. Her name was Myung. She was better than all of us. Kinder, he turned back around, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were haunted. She trusted someone she shouldn't have. A man from the Kim family. He used her to get to my father. She was killed in the crossfire of their betrayal. My father has never forgiven me. He believes I should have protected her. He carried that failure like a shroud. The invulnerable Mafia boss had a gaping wound, and it was shaped like his dead sister. I understood then that his control, his violence, his stillness, it was all a fortress built around that one devastating loss. He would never let anyone get close enough to hurt him like that again. And yet, here I was. The next few days were a blur of gilded captivity. I was a prisoner in a palace, with a view of the entire city and nowhere to go. His men were polite but ever-present. One of them, a stern man named Mr. Choi, seemed to be my designated handler. He brought me food, clothes that someone had purchased for me, tasteful, expensive, and not my style at all, and books. But the doors were locked. The real prison was Kwon Jin-woo himself. He was a constant, unsettling presence. Sometimes he would work for hours in his office, the door open, allowing me to see him command his empire through a series of quiet phone calls. Other times, he would just sit in the living area with me, watching, his silence a heavy blanket. It was during one of those silences that the next attack came. There was no explosion this time. Just the almost inaudible sigh of displaced air and the sharp crack of the window beside my head shattering inward. I threw myself to the floor as a sniper's bullet embedded itself in the wall where my head had been a second before. Jin-woo was moving before the glass even hit the carpet. He dragged a heavy marble coffee table on its side, creating a barricade, and pushed me behind it. His men swarmed the room, weapons drawn, shouting orders. "They have a spotter in the opposite tower," Mr. Choi yelled. Jin-woo was crouched beside me, his body shielding mine again. His hand was on the back of my neck, holding me down, his touch firm and steady amidst the chaos. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning me for injury. "No," I breathed, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. He looked at me, his face inches from mine. The scent of him, cedar and smoke, filled my senses. His dark eyes were blazing with a cold fury. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. It was a raw, unguarded emotion that he couldn't hide, and it was for me. He was terrified of losing me. That's when I knew I was in far deeper than I ever imagined. The bullet hadn't just shattered the window. It had shattered the last of my denial. They captured one of the snipers, a low-level soldier from the Kim clan. They brought him to a warehouse down by the docks, a place that smelled of rust and salt water and despair. Jin-woo told me to stay at the penthouse. I refused. "They tried to kill me," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I have a right to be there." He looked at me for a long moment, a war playing out behind his eyes. He saw the steel in my spine, the refusal to be a passive victim. He gave a single, sharp nod. The interrogation was brutal. The man was loyal, or perhaps just more afraid of his own boss than of Jinwoo. He said nothing, even as blood dripped from his split lip onto the concrete floor. Jinwoo was patient, his violence surgical and deliberate, but he was getting nowhere. I stood in the corner, trying to be invisible, trying not to be sick. Then I noticed it. A small tattoo on the man's wrist, partially hidden by his sleeve. A coiled serpent. During the chaos of the sniper attack, as one of Jinwoo's men had tackled the second shooter on the roof, I'd heard the man shout something in Korean. A curse. An oath. He'd invoked the name of the serpent. The serpent, I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence. Every man in the room, including the prisoner, looked at me. He works for the serpent, I elaborated, stepping forward. Not for the head of the Kim family. The serpent is his uncle, the one trying to usurp power. I looked directly at the prisoner. He thinks you're a loyal soldier, but you're just a pawn in his private war. When this is over, both sides will want you dead. The man's eyes widened in fear. I had given Jinwoo the leverage he needed. I had seen a detail, made a connection, and handed him the key to break his enemy. I had crossed a line. I was no longer an innocent bystander. I was a participant. Jinwoo broke the man in under 5 minutes. Later, back in the silent penthouse, the adrenaline drained away, leaving me hollow and trembling. He came to me, a first aid kit in his hand. A piece of flying glass had grazed my arm during the attack, a thin red line I'd barely noticed. He sat beside me on the sofa, his proximity overwhelming. He gently took my arm, his touch surprisingly soft as he cleaned the cut. His focus was absolute. We were alone, the city's lights a silent witness. You see what I am, he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at my arm anymore. He was looking into my eyes. Everyone else looks away. They pretend not to see the blood. You don't. I'm not sure if that makes me brave or a fool, I whispered, my throat tight. His thumb brushed against my skin, sending a jolt through me. It makes you a survivor, he said. Like me. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous. A confession. An acknowledgement of the darkness they shared. A bond forged in violence and fear. He saw me, and I saw him, and neither of us was looking away. The Kims, or rather the Serpent's faction, grew desperate. They had failed to kill me, failed to intimidate Jinwoo. So they changed tactics. They stopped targeting the fortress and started looking for the cracks in my old life. It happened on a Tuesday. Mr. Choi entered the living room, his face grim. He held a tablet out to Jinwoo. On the screen was a live security feed from a small, unassuming coffee shop. My coffee shop, the one I went to every morning before my shift at Verve. And sitting at my usual table, looking terrified, was my roommate, Sarah. Standing behind her was a man with a coiled serpent tattooed on his neck. The message was clear. They weren't just targeting me anymore. They were targeting my world, my past, my attachments. They were using my life as a weapon against him. Jinwoo's control finally snapped. He didn't rage.
He didn't yell.
He became terrifyingly calm. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He issued a series of quiet, lethal commands into his phone. An empire of shadows and violence moved at his word. Stay here, he ordered me. Lock the doors. Do not let anyone in. He turned to leave, his face carved from granite. But I grabbed his arm.
No.
He stopped, looking down at my hand on his sleeve. This is my friend. My life, I said, my voice shaking with a fury I didn't know I possessed. You don't get to fight this battle without me. They're using me, so I get to be part of the solution. I am not a damsel. I am not a weakness. And I am done being protected. He stared at me, his dark eyes searching mine. He saw no fear, only a burning resolve. He was the king of this violent, broken world, but in that moment, I was his equal. What do you have in mind? he asked, his voice rough. The plan was dangerous. It relied on me, on my knowledge of the serpent's arrogance. He didn't just want me dead. He wanted Jinwoo to watch me die. He wanted to prove he could take what was most valuable to his rival. So we would give him the chance. A meeting was arranged. A trade. My supposed cooperation for my friend's life. It was a trap, and we were walking right into it. The location was an abandoned shipyard, a graveyard of rusting metal and shattered windows. I wore a wire, a cold disc against my skin. Jinwoo and his men were in the shadows, waiting for my signal. But I knew the serpent would be expecting that. He would have sweeps, countermeasures. The wire was a decoy. My real weapon was my mind. I walked into the cavernous warehouse alone. Sarah was tied to a chair in the center of the room, crying silently. The serpent, a man with cruel eyes and an expensive suit, smiled. The brave little waitress, he sneered. Come to sacrifice yourself? How noble. I came to make a deal, I said, keeping my voice steady. You want Jinwoo's territory in the east. I know his shipping routes, his security protocols. I can give them to you. He laughed. You think I'm a fool? He would never trust you with that. He doesn't trust anyone, I countered. But he talks in his sleep. It was a lie, but a plausible one. A lie that played on his perception of me as a simple conquest. The serpent's eyes glittered with greed. This was more than he'd hoped for. He took a step closer, his men fanning out. This was the moment. The trap was about to spring. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking past him, at a specific stack of corroded oil drums near the back wall. In my pocket, my finger rested on the button of a small, untraceable burner phone. I had memorized the layout of this warehouse from blueprints Jinwoo had acquired. I knew its weaknesses. Tell me, the serpent demanded. I took a deep breath. First, let my friend go. He laughed again and gestured for one of his men to put a gun to Sarah's head. I think not. That was his mistake. He thought the game was his to control. I pressed the button. Across the city, a man on Jinwoo's payroll, a disgruntled foreman at the city's gasworks, turned a single valve. It redirected a massive surge of pressure into the old, forgotten pipelines that ran directly beneath the shipyard. Pipelines I knew were there. A low groan echoed from beneath the concrete floor. The serpent looked confused. Then, a high-pitched whine started, growing louder and louder. A geyser of rust-colored water erupted from a seam in the floor, then another. The entire structure began to shudder. The oil drums I'd been watching began to topple, rolling toward a series of exposed, sparking electrical conduits. Chaos erupted. In that confusion, I ran, not for the exit, but for Sarah. I cut her ropes with a small blade Jinwoo had hidden in the heel of my boot. At the same time, Jinwoo's men descended, not from the main entrance the serpent was watching, but from the skylights above, rappelling down like ghosts. The battle was swift and brutal. Jinwoo moved through it all like the eye of a hurricane, a point of deadly calm in the swirling violence. He found me and Sarah, huddled behind a shipping container. He pulled us both to our feet, his eyes locking on mine. He didn't have to say a word. He saw what I had done. I had not just survived his world. I had learned its rules and used them to my advantage. I had saved him from walking into a straightforward ambush. In the aftermath, standing under the cold moonlight, the sirens wailing in the distance, Sarah was taken away to a safe house, shaken but unharmed. My old life was a ghost, a memory. The bridge back to it was a pile of smoldering ash. Jinwoo stood before me. The fight was over. The threat neutralized. The cost had been high. He'd lost 2 men. I had lost my normalcy forever. He reached out, and his fingers gently brushed a smudge of dirt from my cheek. His touch was no longer impersonal or possessive. It was something else entirely. Reverence. My father believes loyalty is paid in blood, he said, his voice quiet, raw. You have shown me it can be earned. He looked at me, and the fortress around his heart crumbled, leaving only the man behind, scarred and vulnerable and whole. Mi-young, she was my responsibility, a debt I could never repay. But you are my choice. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. Later, I stood on the balcony of his penthouse. The sprawling lights of Seoul glittered below, a beautiful, dangerous city. It looked the same as it had that first night, but I was irrevocably changed. I was no longer a waitress who had stumbled into the wrong story. I was the woman who had helped write the ending. I heard him approach, felt his presence behind me, a solid, warm anchor in the cool night air. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat of him. He didn't offer apologies for the world he'd dragged me into. He didn't promise me love or a normal life. He offered the only thing he could, the truth. "They will never touch you again," he said. It was not a boast. It was an oath, sworn to the city and to me. A promise of protection, of possession, of a shared future carved out of violence. And I didn't turn away. I didn't look back at the life I had lost. I looked forward, at the glittering, deadly horizon, and I accepted it all. I chose him. I chose this. This was my home now.